Welcome, thank you for coming. My name is Alexandra and I'm a sculpture major. My work was really based around memory, most specifically memory around my father and his passing, which happened about a year and a half ago. So I really was exploring different phases of memory. I'm going to start with this piece and referencing the sword piece over there, where memories for these pieces are based around object in how the person, my father, used the pieces and also related to them very closely. This one is a pen that's sort of down deep inside this cushion, and he kept this pen with him at all times. He had it on him when he was at school teaching, he had it on him at home when he was playing his computer games. This pen was always with him. And then right when around he passed at the service, my mom hands me the pen and says, "This is yours now." And the weight of this pen felt like I was going to fall to the ground because of how much emotion was wrapped up in this pen. So this piece is really based around that. The development of the pedestal as well as the cushion is to sort of express the importance it has. And also my father being British, the royal gems and stuff were always something that we would go on a trip to go see. And the elaborate pedestals with the cushion was to sort of elevate these small rocks and say how important they were to the country as a whole. So I kind of mimicked that in a way with my cushion development. And then having it drop below the pedestal kind of expresses that weight. Whereas the sword piece, this one was an object that was also very cherished by him, but for different reasons. This one was really sort of indicative of his life. He started out in a very poor family, was the first to even finish grade school, let alone go on to college, let alone be a professor of biomedical engineering. So for him to be able to afford an antique sword was a huge step in his life status, especially growing up in England. Class was still very much a prominent thing in their society and still is to this day. So for him in a low-class family to be able to afford an antique like this was really a big thing for him. And then also it carried weight for us in the family because he, in his youth, was a fencer and very closely came to joining the Olympics and representing England for fencing. So he always cherished the process of fencing and the act of it. As well, he always, being Brit, enjoyed the history of England, which we always got some minor debates about. But he was really a fan of the British Empire, and this sword, being a British infantry sword, is kind of also indicative of that. So this sword carries three main reasons why our family now cherishes it beyond what its financial worth is. And so behind in the shadows of the sword are video images of family footage, so referencing the actual interaction with my father and the family, as well as fencing videos from the 80s, which is around the era in which he would have been in the Olympics, as well as a TV program, Sharks, which is a British TV show from the 80s and 90s about a soldier who started as a foot soldier and was raised through the ranks for his valor. Very similar, my dad felt he raised himself through the ranks through his knowledge and his work in education, so he associated himself a lot with that character. So that all kind of brings in sort of the history behind the sword, and that's why it's resting in the shadows behind the actual object. And then those are kind of past memories, memories that the objects really brought forth these feelings. This piece really references what I think is one of the hardest things when you're dealing with the loss of somebody, is trying to imagine your life now without that person, when you had, up until that point, assumed that person was going to be there for you. And you have all of these imagined times where you're going to have Christmases together, you're going to go on trips together, you're going to do all of these things with this person that now aren't going to happen. So this piece is referencing how my dad and I were planning out a retirement journey he was going to go on, where he was going to take his Camaro and try and circumnavigate the globe, kind of venturing towards that great expansion that the British Empire had, as well as just this fun-loving journey that he really always wanted to do. And since he passed before that was able to happen, I kind of created this in a way to fill that bucket for him, let him have that journey, and also let me have back a little bit of those, what I've been calling future memories that I had to let go in his passing, have a little moment of it back for myself and for my family. Because we all really enjoyed the idea of him going on that journey, and he really wanted to. And so this way we feel it kind of in a very small way, gave ourselves that back, as well as his memory gave him that. And then this piece over here is a fibronectin molecule. It's supposed to seem a little uncomfortable with the rest of the pieces because this is what I'm calling parallel memory, in that at his service, he was a professor of biomedical engineering, like I discussed earlier, and most of the attendants there were his students and his peers. And they all wanted to talk to me about who he was as a professor, what his science did for the world. And I realized very quickly that I didn't know that man they were trying to tell me. He was similar to who I had grown up with, but he wasn't as fun-loving, he wasn't as carefree, he was a much more rigid, stoic man that was being explained to me. And also, I found that the science that he did was something that the world will always remember, such as he developed a super hydrophobic coating in his time at Case Western Reserve, which is now coating all heart stents, all hip implants, all heart implants, well, the false heart implants, this is, the pacemakers and stuff, so that the body doesn't reject it. So there are people alive today because of what my father did, and so luckily his name will carry on that way, whereas what I've remembered as my father will die with me and through the documentation of this work. So that's why I made this molecule out of bronze, because generally when we're making monuments for our society to hold on to, we make them out of durable, long-lasting materials, and bronze is one of them that's used quite frequently. So I chose bronze to kind of give that work he did this longevity, but then also for me, it's this acceptance of a parallel person, or a parallel memory that I didn't really have that I'm trying to assimilate after the service and talking to these people. I really wanted to get to know my father in that way. Doing the research into trying to understand exactly what he went through to make this science that he did, I realized that every word basically led to another dictionary, and then every dictionary definition led to an article in a thesis document and textbooks, and I would basically have to go back and start again with basic biology and work my way up to actually understand what he did. So for me, this is kind of this other thing that I'm trying to work into my life and work into my art, but it still feels awkward. So I kind of have it off into the corner, and it's made out of very different materials than it was. And also, every single item that you see in front of me was not actually fabricated by me in any way. The 3D model was found for me by one of his students in an open source database. And then that model I gave to my husband, and he formatted it so that it could be printed. And then we emailed that format off to the printing services, and they printed me the 3D molecule, which was actually 3 separate sections. And then that 3D was given to the foundry, and then they made the piece and put it on this stand here. And then the metal piece was also made by other people, to kind of keep in context with how this is other people's memories that I'm trying to associate with. Whereas these pieces, my hands were all over. I did every step of the way as much as I could do personally without. When I needed assistance, I would get it, but for the most part, it was me. Whereas this was very much just me managing, and that's kind of how I felt about those memories that I'm trying to work with. So in general, that's what I did here. I don't know if I'm at 10 minutes or...
You are. So
okay.
Any questions?
Right, sweet. Well,
So I am a photography major, but I've also been doing some work in film. And the work that you're seeing here is an excerpt from a very large project that I've been working on for my entire time here, all 3 years. And it's around the subject of debt. So this project came out of my own experience with debt. I entered into the grad program after working as a commercial photographer for about 10 years. And then somewhere around 2008, 2009, I had a lot of difficulty in my business with the economic crash, and I basically racked up in debt what I had lost in income living in San Francisco, living off of my credit card, not such a smart idea. And so I filed for bankruptcy, decided I wanted to go back to school and sort of kind of explore some other avenues in terms of what I was doing with my career. And when I got to school and I was kind of trying to think about things that I was interested in, I started thinking about the subject of debt and how my experience had been so monumental in my life. And I was talking to a lot of friends about that and realizing how little people talk about it. And I talked about it quite a bit more after my bankruptcy because I felt like this huge weight had been lifted, but then leading up to it, I had had all these sort of like, personal responses to the subject and the idea of the way that debt kind of plays into our society and into our sort of personal psyche. So that was something that I wanted to explore in the project. So I set out to photograph, I didn't actually have a number in mind when I first started this project, but I started by photographing people primarily in the Bay Area. A lot of these were people who were through word of mouth, who were interested in talking about their debt on camera. So, and then I set up a formal portrait of them in their homes and recorded an interview with them on camera, and then everybody wrote down the story of their debt on a piece of paper. So once I started the project, it felt very specific to the Bay Area. The Bay Area was starting to undergo a lot of changes as well. But then I kind of really got interested in what debt looks like nationally. So I kind of decided to sort of take the project on like a much bigger scale, and I set out to photograph 99 people across the US. And the 99 is meant to represent the 99% from the slogan, "We are the 99%," which came out of the Occupy movement. That represents, is around the idea that 1% of the wealth in this country, or 1% of the people in this country hold the majority of the wealth in this country, and then what's left over is the 99%, often who have lots of debt. So, so I largely started this by asking people, so for the first probably 10 subjects, it was through word of mouth. And finding people who were eligible to be photographed and to participate wasn't really hard, but finding people who wanted to participate. I even found that socially talking to people about debt, it's not really something that people are thrilled to like have conversations over at dinner parties and whatnot. But usually once people start talking, they actually find it to be pretty beneficial. So that sort of became some of the root about this project, is that it's a very privately experienced part of our culture, but it's really publicly enforced. So it's something that's, in order to, to even get an education, unless you come from privilege, it's practically required that you go into debt. So it's something that, and then as far as our debt system works and our credit system, in order to make certain gains in terms of buying a house, renting an apartment, all these things, you have to have a certain kind of credit score. In order to have a certain kind of credit score, you have to have debt. You actually get penalized for having no debt. So it's like something that I consider to be really culturally enforced, but sort of privately experienced, because once you get to a certain point with your debt, it's considered something that's typically viewed as shameful. So for the first 10 people, they were mainly through word of mouth, and then I kind of branched out and I started using Craigslist. So I posted an ad on Craigslist looking for participants, and then I started traveling for this project as well. After sort of realizing that I was really only getting this regional perspective, I traveled to, I went to Portland, Detroit, and New York. And then it was all personally funded for about the first year and a half. And then I kind of I was probably at about 30 portraits. And I realized that I really couldn't do it on my own, so I did a Kickstarter. So I did some crowdfunding to sort of do another chapter in that. And I traveled to New Orleans and Boston and Maine. So in total, I've been to 5 cities, and I'm actually only at 50 portraits right now, so I'm only halfway there. So it's definitely still an unfinished project. But I think it was, it was a really interesting experience seeing the difference between how people's relationship to debt changes based on their geography. A lot of cities have a lot of a specific culture around debt. New Orleans, having dealt with Katrina, they have a lot of stories that came out of getting disaster funding that then came at a price, things like that. And Detroit has a huge relationship with debt, seeing as the city has filed for bankruptcy themselves. So that was one of the things I was really interested in. I wanted to photograph people in their homes, kind of similar to classic Dutch, portraiture, where people are depicted amongst their worldly belongings, because I find that as viewers, we often associate sort of a dollar amount or a certain kind of judgment around seeing people with their things, and then considering their relationship to debt and their relationship to money and wealth in terms of that. So that was one of the reasons that they're all sort of photographed in this way. I was also kind of thinking a lot about compositionally their relationship to the camera, the space around them, foreground to background. That was also built a lot out of that traditional portrait painting. For the most part, these are they're lit with professional lighting. There's a couple of them that are natural light, but I go into the space, I light them, I have everybody sit down, and we do an interview, and then we do the photograph. And they're shot digitally, but I kind of approached this. I used to shoot film for many years on a large format camera, and I kind of approached it with the same in the same way. Like I probably only take about 30 frames per shot. And then, as I mentioned, everybody writes down the story of their debt, the amount of their debt, and then their occupation on a sheet of paper. And that's what's displayed over here on the right. These are actually, with the exception of 2 of them, I think, are the originals, so they're handwritten. I really liked the idea of having people write their own stories so that they got to have a voice in the project as well, because I wasn't quite sure how I was going to work with the sound component, and I'm still sort of sorting that out. But having the handwritten pieces was a way to sort of also kind of create something physical out of something that's very invisible, which I thought was really interesting. And then I decided to display them separately from the photographs because I really wanted to avoid having it turn into a matching game and having it be installation where each photograph is read based on what their story is individually. I'm much more interested in the role that debt plays kind of as a whole. I mean, while personally when I'm engaging with the subject, their story in particular is very interesting for me, and I think having that exchange with them is often pretty cathartic, and that's kind of part of my interest in it as well, is having that sort of communal exchange where people can actually feel like they're not really that alone in the process is important. But as a whole, for the project, I'm interested in having everybody's story be part of the larger problem, I think, with debt. And so having them be displayed separately kind of has them be a body of work versus each individual person and their story. I mean, I think sometimes it inevitably turns into a matching game. And then the film was sort of, I went through a lot of variations on how to deal with a lot of the footage that I had shot for the project, and this kind of morphed out of that. I was interested in kind of making a piece that was sort of traditional in terms of narrative storytelling, but also kind of incorporated my own experience and my own story and my own comparison between myself and the subjects that I included. And so this is one of the subjects. She's not actually pictured here, but she is one of the early subjects that I shot. And she's somebody that I had, a prior relationship to. I knew her personally through another friend of mine, and she was, a friend of mine who'd always said, like, oh, my girlfriend, she has like enormous amounts of debt. She doesn't like to talk about it. I don't even know how much she has. She works 3 jobs. And then I started talking to her about it, and she was like, I'd really like to participate. That might be really good for me. It might really help me kind of deal with it a little bit better. So I kind of set out to do that with her. I could kind of relate to her a lot in terms of her personal relationship with it. And so I just kind of wanted to create this story that sort of, travels through kind of a day in the life of both her and my experience with debt. And so that's the film. So yeah.
Questions?
Hi, I'm Randy. I made this stuff. This is part of my series, Objects Behaving Badly. And I started making these things about a year and a half ago. At the time, my personal life wasn't going very well. And I was kind of trying to figure out what I should be working on. And I was kind of in a little bit of a rut. And I was in IKEA one day. And I was there with my fiance, and we were walking through IKEA, and we were arguing, because that's what people do at IKEA. And we were looking for shelves, because we figured if we got shelves, maybe like our home life would be more peaceful, and we'd have one less thing to argue about. So shelves, we were there to get shelves. And we were walking through IKEA, and I came upon this chair, and we both stopped, and it was on a pedestal, and we were both looking at the chair. And she's like, that's a nice chair. And I'm like, yes, that is a nice chair. And at the time she was taking experimental film class, and she's like, I could do weird things with that chair. I'm like, what do you mean? And we started to talk. And she's like, I could put a camera under the chair and film up. I'm like, well, you can't just like put a camera. You have to like, and we kind of discussed it for a bit. And I'm like, I'll build that chair. And what became interesting to me not so much was that filming from underneath a chair, but the fact that this object went from being just a mass-produced object, there's tens of thousands of these in the world, maybe more, to an object that suddenly became a participant in a relationship. And basically, it's pretty given at this point we define who we are based on the objects we consume and the way we present ourselves. Like you look at my clothing and you're like, oh, you make certain assumptions about me. And so it's kind of interesting that we're taking these mass-produced things and kind of defining these singular identities. But what became really interesting was that all of a sudden this mass-produced thing not only defined my identity, but her identity and our identity together. It became kind of this in-between between us. And so I started to really kind of think about that and kind of experiment with that. And so in my mind, I'm like, okay, the obvious solution is go back to IKEA. So we did that a few times, and some things worked out, some things didn't, but this was another one. It's a shag rug. It's basically this sheepskin rug, which I've modified to have these restraints which fold out, which seem functional but are not. But I'll come back to that aspect of whatever. But in doing this, what I came to realize is as we went to IKEA and things became less and less interesting and we were acquiring more and more stuff, I went home and I looked around the apartment. I realized we have too much stuff. And then I realized most of the stuff was mine. And then I realized like most of the stuff was not functional or useful, and it was just stuff I was hoarding because I liked it. And that's where this series, These Stupid Fucking Things, came about, because I was looking around and I was thinking to myself, look at all these stupid fucking things. And I began to think about that because basically they were things which only gave me singular pleasure, and she really can't like stand this stuff. And I'm like, I'm going to make it so they can only give me pleasure. And I like began to think about that. I thought it was kind of funny. So I like made that kind of literal. But yeah, I mean, those speakers I found on the sidewalk I had for 4 years prior. I turned them on once to see that they worked. They didn't sound very good, but I kept them anyway. This filing cabinet was from work. It belonged to one coworker, then another coworker, then to me. Then they were going to throw it out. I'm like, can't throw it out. It's a sticker. So I brought it home. I never used it. Same with the guitar. It broke 3 times. I tried to fix it. The fix didn't really take, but I kept it anyway. So yeah, that's kind of where I was going with that. And then from there, I started to think a lot about functionality. And there's 2 works I made. One actually is in the series, is not here, but the other is here, which is Bedfellow. The work not here is called Self-Portrait as Artist's Lamp, which is basically my functional replacement in the relationship. And the other work is Bedfellow, which is her functional replacement. The thing is with Bedfellow, you assume a bedfellow, you're in a mutually exclusive relationship, like that's my bedfellow. But what was it? A bedfellow is someone who shares their bed with another. So what was interesting about my bedfellow is that she was sharing my bed with others. So I'm like, why not just have my bed share itself? And then I don't need that. So I made a bed which can share itself. It's currently not programmed to do that, but it looks for other people and drives towards them. And that's basically kind of what that work is. Yeah. I should note that this was actually our bed frame and mattress of like 8 years that I've essentially turned into a self-driving electric car. A really weird self-driving electric car. But yeah, any which way. So functionality. So the interesting thing about, so I come back to that. The interesting thing about functionality is that at the end of the day, this really only does one thing. And it does one really crude thing, one really simple thing. And I've built it, I've given it a lot of, I've basically over-engineered it to do one really kind of, in some level, stupid thing. And part of why I did that is because the objects we own are less about being functional and more about kind of how we relate to them and our need to feel like that function has been fulfilled. So I was thinking a lot about that when making these objects, like with the rug. it's like, yes, you could restrain someone to the rug, but they could just get up and walk away. But it's the idea that like you can do this. That's really kind of what this work is about. It's kind of like how we relate to these objects and how we relate to each other. And it kind of says more about our needs and our desires, and it's less about being functional in that way. One thing I like to repeat over and over and over is that engineers are concerned with solving problems in the most efficient way and designers the most elegant. As an artist, I could solve problems in the most interesting way, and that's not necessarily the best solution. It's usually the worst solution, and yeah, it's great and all when dealing with abstract concepts and theories. When applying it to one's own personal relationship, it doesn't necessarily end up with the best results. But nonetheless, since these objects are less about their actual functionality and more about kind of like their symbolic functionality in a way, and some level they are, I feel like, useful tools in my life. But yeah, how am I on time? Any questions?
Hi everybody, thank you for coming and thank you for enduring until the very last talk. I appreciate it. So this is my piece for the thesis exhibition. And it consists of 3 slow motion looping videos that were filmed with a lens that I built myself for my camera. Or I guess I modified it, really. Built sounds much more impressive. So when I first started in photography, I really started in this, when there was like this transition point between traditional film photography and digital photography. And so because of that, there was tons and tons of film-based products available, like in the used market, they were just like going for a song. And so I ended up collecting a ton of like vintage camera parts that I couldn't really use for anything, but I felt like they couldn't just be thrown away or gone to waste. So I ended up having quite the collection. And eventually I started taking them apart and putting them back together in strange different ways. Initially, what I wanted to do was build my own macro lens, which didn't exactly happen. But instead I got something much more amazing and wonderful out of the process. So when I entered into the program here, I kind of wanted to take that a step or two further. After some work in the program, I kind of stumbled upon through maybe like a celestial event or something like that. I stumbled upon the huge breadth of the New Age community in the Bay Area, which kind of in turn led me to purchasing a lot of rock crystals, natural mineral crystals, particularly quartz, which is supposed to have the effect of healing and helping you transmit positive energy into your being and into your life. So I started kind of taking those crystals, which are clear and really beautiful objects, and putting them into my lenses. I would either put them inside of the lens or I would attach them on the outside, and I started doing still photography and video with it. So that's what you see here. Because of that, and because of the way I was messing up the lenses, I couldn't actually get it to take photos of anything. So it distorted it so much that everything that came out of that lens was abstracted. So what it ended up being is that I ended up making photographs of what was happening inside of the lens instead of what was happening outside of it, which I felt like was a really interesting way to kind of turn photography on its head. And what you're seeing in these videos is the actual light bouncing around inside of the crystals. Yes, okay, so that's my process. But I did mention the New Age community before, and that actually ended up making a big influence on how I approached art making as well. I ended up studying with a couple different groups, and they worked a lot with energy and moving energy, transforming energy from something negative into something positive. And oftentimes that would happen in a ritual space, in a space that would be like demarcated away from the mundane world. So you can kind of see with this installation here that I have this light blocking mesh, and it's still within the gallery, but it's been separated out into something that isn't quite in the gallery at the same time. It also, technically it blocks out the light, so it makes it dim enough to see the pieces. But I think it really also it transforms it into sort of a liminal space. So a lot of these New Age communities, when they're working, this like energy work that they're doing, they call it magic. And so a lot of people think of magic as like card tricks or pulling a rabbit out of a hat or something like that. But a lot of these communities, people in these communities, think that magic is the changing of consciousness from your own choice. And that idea I found really beautiful and really wonderful, and I realized that that's what a lot of artists try to do as well. They're trying to, at least for the briefest, tiniest moment, change someone's idea or even their emotions for a split second. And if you've done that, then you've made an effective art piece. So I was interested in that parallel and started kind of thinking about maybe my work as a possible magic, is that I can transform consciousness, at least for a moment or two. So then that also nicely ties in back into those crystals that I was using before. So there's the big New Age thing in there, but I also feel like this work also addresses photography and what photography and video can be. I started out doing still photography and transitioned into video, but this obviously doesn't look like traditional photography. I was really intrigued and interested. I think I've said the word interested like 15 times already, but interested in what else it could be used for besides capturing reality. So while this is it's technically reality because it's reality on some scale that we can't see, but it's happening inside of the lens. It's not the reality we experience. So to take a tool that has been set up, that's being used right now to film me to record reality and to transform it into something that that doesn't do that is, I think it's really astounding and a really enjoyable part of my practice. So I think I am really good at condensing down what I have to say into a much smaller amount of time than what I'm supposed to take up. So I think that I've kind of covered all of my points. If anybody has any questions for me, I'd be glad to answer them. No?
You said you weren't using the photograph process in a conventional way.
Mm-hmm.
Can you say how you're using the video in an unconventional way?
Oh yeah. I can talk more about how I ended up filming this, because this isn't very traditional video either. So these are all shot one take, and the way they're filmed is with a home astronomer's tripod. So it is set up. It's set up originally to track the moon through the sky as it moves through the sky during the night, so you don't have to keep readjusting your telescope. But instead, I have it set up so that it orbits around a studio light. And I really think of these videos as more akin to photographs than video, because there's no narrative, there's no scene change, there's no cuts. And because it moves so slowly that it's kind of at first hard to perceive that it's even moving at all. That I feel like this kind of operates in this in-between space between photography and video. I think maybe that answered your question. Oh right, I didn't even actually talk about like the imagery that is apparent in these videos, just was talking about my process instead. So I feel that these images, which is great because they're filmed with these pieces that come out of the earth, and yet they really evoke deep space. And but I've heard lots of different interpretations, which I really love. I really love that the potential in abstract work to be able to pull all kinds of different meanings out of it. But to me, that's what they feel like to me, and I think it's really wonderful that also because it's happening on such a macro level that something so small can appear so large and reference something that is so much bigger than what we can comprehend. Lately, I've been thinking about Socrates' idea of mimesis, and which is, to get the shortened version, is Socrates kind of felt like all art was like this third-hand lie because it was trying to reproduce something that was created by the hand of God, and it just like you couldn't ever come close enough to do it. So I acknowledge that, and I think that the interesting part of my work is that I'm trying to kind of recreate this image of the universe and failing, and I really like my failed results. So yeah.
Can you speak to the staging of the way this is presented as if it's in some sort of a church?
Yeah. So part of it is kind of referencing the kind of spiritual nature of what I have investigated, and kind of, but then also the church view in and of itself is, I grew up in a really pretty strict Christian household, and church was a big part of our lives for a long time. And so I think in some ways I've kind of reclaimed that quiet contemplative space of church, of the chapel, and kind of put it back into my art. And also, that I'm kind of, that I'm pulling from someone else's spiritual beliefs, so I might as well, keep pulling. But in addition to the bench, the whole setup, the triptych, again, is a big thing in a lot of religious art. And I was really inspired by the triptych shape, by the triptych by Keith Haring in the Grace Cathedral. I had a nice moment with that, and kind of wanted to run with that form, because I thought it was a good way to put my ideas across. Did that answer your question? Yeah, kind of.